Hey folks, how's it going? Dr. Spin. Eclectic album reviews and general musical meanderings. Welcome to my top 20 of 2024. This is my favorite albums that I've listened to throughout this year. I've listened to over 150 albums, and through this kind of weird process of elimination, I've come up with this list of 20. Now keep in mind that whenever I do my year-end lists, this is not necessarily things that were released in 2024. Those albums are included. But there's albums that maybe were released 3 or 4 years ago, 20 years ago, albums I'm trying to fill in parts of holes in my collection, just whatever music I listened to this year. These are the ones that rose to the top. And there are some kind of loose rules, one of which is that there can't be 2 albums by a single artist on the top 20. If there's 2 albums by the same artist, one of them has to be representative of that artist. And the other is that although there is sort of a loose rubric that I look at these albums in terms of their genre and the way they contribute to the overall scheme of music out there, there's also this aspect of it of these are albums that kind of meant something to me this year. They were attached to experiences that will probably be forever stamped on this music as I go back and listen to it as I live out the rest of my existence. So coming in at number 20, I've got Hjalmar's Skyjaborgin. Once you get past the kind of novelty label that these guys have as being an Icelandic reggae group, you can really kind of look at the amount of thought, I think, that goes into the music that these guys make. They're able to really pay homage to reggae without pretending like they're Jamaican. They still really have a very clearly Icelandic identity, and they're able to inject that into their music. But again, the thing that really holds this album together is their amazing songwriting. And songwriting was kind of a metric that I kind of kept coming back to this year. You're going to hear me talk about it over and over again as I go through this list. Not the least of which, of course, is the example that you can see on number 19, which is MoTroopers' Troper Sings Brion. For me, as a fan of John Bryan's Meaningless, the 2000 classic 2000 singular solo album from this idiosyncratic artist, I've always wanted to follow it to this album, and MoTroper, I think, is another one of those guys that really feels that way, who's a great pop songwriter in and of his own, and was able to get a hold of some unfinished demo tapes that John Bryan had kind of had floating around the LA scene, and reinvented them and put some meat on the bones and really created a great album that, although I think if you side-by-sided it with Meaningless, you kind of see how it wasn't the exact same thing, how it maybe differs. But with the time and space between them, I think it's a good enough tribute to what John Bryan did on that album that it satisfies that side of it for me as well. And coming in at number 18, I've got Avalanche Kaito's Talitakum. Now, I know I just got through talking about songwriting, but I also have a side of me that really loves eclectic experimental music, and certainly Avalanche Kaio fills that bill. But what really I think sets them apart from just being kind of another noise rock, math rocky band, which they do incredibly well actually, is their crossover intercultural identity. The concept behind this band of being sort of a half European noise rock and half rebellious African griot, I think is a really amazing mix of transgression that sets them apart, I think, and gives them a very distinctive identity. Coming in at number 17, I've got Leprous' Melodies of Atonement. Now, I've been following Leprous for the last couple of years, really been looking for an opportunity to put them in the top 20. This one leans pretty strongly in a pop direction, even though it doesn't give up the progressive rock and heavy metal roots of this band. But more importantly, this is an album that just kind of kept coming up for me throughout the year, and it's my son's favorite album. He will tell me, like, I love this album, it's my favorite. And so that kind of also gives me another level of attachment to Melodies of Atonement that makes it a standout album for this year. At number 16, I got Autechre's LP5. Autechre Autechre is a band that really creates its own world within their albums. It's a very experimental album and a good example of mid-90s intelligent dance music. And even though this is another one might sort of countermand my affection for songwriting, so many fascinating sounds and really amazing rhythms. They have this song 777 that is in 7 is probably one of the most banging 7 grooves I've heard in a long time. I love it. And even though it doesn't have a whole lot of melody, that groove, the insistent groove that it has, really sells it. And I think that's something that this album has going for it overall. It's just its ability to cohere within itself in a really commanding way. Coming in at number 15, I've got the Guess Who's Plein d'Amour. Now this is an album I think if you're a Jellyfish fan you should not pass up. They really are somehow able to capture that bittersweet orchestral pop feel that Jellyfish in some ways really commandeered as far as their voice goes in the mid-90s. But on top of the fantastic music on this album, there's a really interesting back history here because this band was, up until very recently, known as The Guess Who. And there's this interesting history as to how this band ended up with the name The Guess Who and whether there was legitimacy there. And this last year, there was quite a bit of conversation surrounding the band's identity as The Guess Who. But it looks like they may have lost that battle because a couple of weeks ago, I noticed that all the Guess Who stuff got wiped from the internet. And then the Spotify link for the album now calls this band Derek Sharpe and the Champagne Jam. And everything has been rethemed that way. So they may have lost that battle as far as the name goes, but they won the battle, I think, musically speaking. Great album. From number 14, I got Asgier Trausti's Dýrð i Dugafast. Despite the fact throughout the course of the year I've never really learned to pronounce the name of this album correctly, it is a really great album that has, I think, a cultural importance to Icelandic, like mainland Icelandic culture is very widely known. And Asgier Trausti, as a musician, has a lot of connections to other Icelandic musicians. He has a lot of collaborations that I think are very fruitful, and he has a very strong voice within those collaborations. This particular album is also a collaboration between himself and his 74-year-old grandfather. And if you're a fan of Bon Iver's music before he started getting into really heavy production experimentation, you'll find a lot to connect with on this album, even if you don't understand the lyrics. And I believe there is a English language version of this that I have not heard yet, but certainly musically speaking, this version of the album is fantastic. And again, worth your time if you're willing to overlook the language barrier that will obviously be an issue if you're an English-speaking listener. All right, coming in at number 13, I got Floating Points, Eleania. And this album is one of those examples in which there was 2 albums that I listened to by Floating Points this year, but only one of them could make it. Of course, Cascade was released just a few months ago, and whenever I put Eleania back into rotation earlier this year as a save from last year, I had no idea that Floating Points would be releasing an album a little bit later. And as much as I really did love Cascade, it didn't break boundaries in the same way. It's a very, very excellent and thought-provoking EDM dance album, but Eleania is something way, way more. It has that aspect to it. It also breaks off the things it sounds like could have been off Bitches Brew, and also some 20th century like composition style music. Again, shows the breadth of Floating Point's interest in his genius, I think, in a way that really would come to fruition a couple of years later with that fantastic album Promises. At number 12, I've got Jeff Rosenstock's Hellmode. If you're a fan like me of mid-90s punk pop, Green Day, and early Weezer around the time when they were being really noisy and more experimental, like, Pinkerton, that era, Jeff Rosenstock, I think, is going to speak to you really clearly. He's able to capture the energy of that time and that sound, the excitement around that kind of music, writes great songs in that style, and also is extremely relevant. What he's talking about right now feels like important to the way that we are experiencing our lives right now. As one reviewer called it, apocalypse therapy. And I think that this album feels that way when you listen to it, something to connect to and feel like you're not alone in the insanity that we're having to deal with in our contemporary world. And finally, at number 11, I've got Peter Gabriel's I.O., the Dark Side mix. I spent a lot of time this year contemplating Peter Gabriel's I.O., both mixes of it. I spent 6 months listening to the Dark Side mix. I spent 6 months listening to the Light Side mix. And after much deliberation on both sides, I decided the Dark Side mix, to me personally, is the superior one. And it would seem, of course, me being such a hardcore Genesis fan, a hardcore Peter Gabriel fan, this would seem like it would be, a shoo-in for Album of the Year. And it's a fantastic album. So much great stuff that goes on with it. But if you've heard me talk about this album, there are a few tracks on here I think they're a little bit more tedious than others. And tedious is a term that I've never had to use to describe Peter Gabriel's music ever. But even those tedious songs are amazing and beautiful and touching and well thought out. And they are actually far outweighed by the more dynamic and more idiosyncratically Peter Gabriel songs that are on this album. But it's those little dents in the armor that have kept it from being Album of the Year. But still, a great album and worth your time, especially as a Peter Gabriel fan. And that's where I'm going to stop for now. We're going to continue with the rest of the top 20 in my next post, so please keep a lookout for that. At the end of this post, I have a few honorable mention albums that maybe didn't quite make the top 20, but are still excellent albums. And if you want to see how the rest of this is going to play out, please like and subscribe, share this video out with your friends, and also follow me over on Spotify. I'm going to have a top 20 list. I've got a big list from all the stuff I've listened to throughout the course of this year, so please check that out if you have the opportunity. And until you see you next time, I'll catch you on the flip side.